Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today, we're looking at something that's been in the news a lot recently. All those AI-generated images and how they can spread misinformation, especially during a crisis like those fires we saw in LA. I mean, seriously, have you seen some of those pictures?
Oh, yeah. It's incredible how realistic they've gotten.
It's pretty scary, actually, because it's getting harder and harder to tell what's real and what's not.
And when you're in the middle of an emergency situation, you don't exactly have time to sit there and fact check everything you see online.
Right, exactly. So today we're going to try to sort through some of that chaos. We're going to look at some of the myths and rumors that were spreading on social media during the LA fires and try to separate the fact from the fiction.
Sounds good.
Okay, so myth number one. Picture this. You're scrolling through your feed and you see this incredibly vivid image. The Hollywood sign engulfed in flames. I mean, just totally ablaze.
That would be terrifying, especially if you've ever been there or, have it on your bucket list to visit someday.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that sign is such an iconic landmark. Right. It's like a symbol of Hollywood itself. But here's the thing. It never happened.
Right. It was completely fake.
Jeff Zarnem, the chairman of the Hollywood Sign Trust, actually confirmed that the sign was safe and sound.
He even stayed behind during the evacuations to keep an eye on it.
Really?
Yeah. Talk about dedication.
Wow, that's amazing. I guess he really takes his job seriously.
He must.
So yeah, that image was just a very convincing fake. And if you think about it geographically, the fire was west of the 101 freeway, and the sign is east.
So there's no way it could have been affected.
Exactly. It's just simple geography. But in the heat of the moment, when people are scared and looking for information, it's easy to see how something like that could spread.
Absolutely. People share things without even thinking sometimes.
All right. So ready for myth number two.
Hit me.
Okay. This one involves a video that was going around showing Rick Caruso,
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, claiming that the Palisades Reservoir was completely empty and saying that this was why firefighters were having trouble with water pressure.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it sounds pretty bad, right?
Yeah, it does.
But the thing is, it's not entirely true.
It's kind of a half-truth.
Right.
So, yeah, one of the reservoirs, the Santa Ynez Reservoir, was actually closed for repairs.
Okay.
But that wasn't the main reason for the water pressure problems.
So what was?
Well, the LA Department of Water and Power explained that the Palisades area was experiencing like 4 times the normal demand for water.
4 times?
Yeah, for 15 hours straight.
I can't even imagine.
It's like every single person in the area was running their faucets and hoses at full blast for an entire workday.
Oh, wow.
And 3 of the storage tanks, which are like these giant reserves within the water system, actually ran dry.
So even if that other reservoir had been open, it wouldn't have made much of a difference.
It might have bought them a little bit of time, but it wouldn't have solved the problem.
So it wasn't really about negligence or anything like that. It was just the system being totally overwhelmed.
Right. It's kind of like when you have a massive traffic jam.
Yeah.
Even if you add more lanes to the highway, it doesn't always solve the problem because there are just too many cars trying to get through.
That's a good analogy. So this myth about the reservoir is a perfect example of how a little bit of truth can get twisted and amplified.
Yeah.
Especially when it comes from someone who seems like they know what they're talking about.
Right. And in a crisis situation, people are looking for answers. They want to understand what's happening.
So they latch on to anything that sounds plausible.
Especially if it confirms their existing beliefs or fears.
Exactly. And social media just amplifies all of that.
Yeah. It's like a perfect storm for misinformation.
And, there's actually some research on this. From Stevens Institute of Technology in Jen, they found that people rely heavily on social media during crises for real-time updates.
Yeah. Oh, that makes sense.
People are turning to platforms like X and Instagram and even just like neighborhood Facebook groups.
It's where they're getting their news.
Yeah, because it feels more immediate and personal than traditional news sources.
And it is. It's faster, it's more accessible, and it's often coming from people you know and trust.
But that's also what makes it so dangerous.
Right. Because that speed and accessibility also means that misinformation can spread like wildfire.
Exactly.
And sometimes people share things with good intentions. They just want to be helpful.
They want to warn others.
But without proper verification, they can actually end up doing more harm than good.
And it's not always intentional either.
No, sometimes it's just carelessness or a lack of awareness.
But the consequences can be real.
It's true. I mean, haven't we all seen it? Where a friend shares something on social media and you're like, wait a minute, is that even real? But when it comes to a wildfire or any other kind of crisis situation, misinformation isn't just annoying. It can actually be really dangerous.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, imagine if you're trying to evacuate and you see a post saying that a certain road is closed, but it's not true, and you end up stuck in traffic right in the path of the fire.
That's a terrifying thought.
It's a good reminder that we need to be extra careful about what we believe and what we share online.
Yeah.
Especially during emergencies.
Right, because the stakes are so much higher.
Okay, so we've talked about those specific myths that were circulating during the LA fires, but this whole situation raises a bigger question, right? Like, how do we navigate this sea of information, especially when it's coming at us so fast?
Yeah, it's a real challenge in the digital age. It's like we're all amateur detectives now, constantly having to sift through clues and try to piece together the truth.
And it feels like the stakes are getting higher all the time. Misinformation isn't just annoying anymore. It can actually have a real impact on our lives.
Absolutely. I mean, think about it. Misinformation can erode trust in authorities. It can sow division among communities, and it can even lead to harmful actions based on false information.
Right, it's not just about being a savvy internet user, it's about staying safe and informed. But how do we actually do that? Where do we even start?
Where I think one of the most important things is to be aware of your own emotional state. When you're feeling anxious or stressed, you're more susceptible to falling for misinformation.
Oh, that makes sense.
So if you're scrolling through your feed and you see something that makes your heart race or triggers a strong emotional response, just take a moment to pause and breathe.
Yeah, I think that's good advice in general. Just take a step back and don't let your emotions get the best of you.
Exactly. Once you're in a calmer state of mind, you can start asking those critical questions like, who's sharing this information? What's their motivation? Does it align with what you're seeing from other sources, especially official ones?
So it's not just about reading a headline or watching a video and accepting it at face value. It's about digging a little deeper, doing your own research.
Exactly. It's about being curious and a little bit skeptical. Not cynical, but discerning, you know?
I like that.
Think of it like a mental checklist. Source, motivation, corroboration. Those are your key ingredients for evaluating information online.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about those times when you're really not sure? Like you're seeing conflicting reports and it's hard to tell what's true.
That's when it's helpful to turn to those reliable sources we talked about earlier. Government agencies, emergency responders, established news outlets. They have systems in place to gather and verify information, and they're accountable for what they put out there.
It's kind of like the difference between getting medical advice from a doctor versus relying on a random blog post, you know?
Exactly. You wouldn't trust your health to just anyone.
Right.
The same principle applies to information during a crisis.
You want information from a source that has a track record of accuracy and a commitment to the truth.
And even then, it's still wise to cross-check information. Look for multiple sources reporting the same thing. And be wary of anything that seems too sensational or too good to be true.
Okay, so we're all about being discerning detectives here. But what about when we see our friends or family sharing something that seems questionable? Do we call them out?
That's a great question, and it can be a tricky situation to navigate. You don't want to start an argument or alienate anyone, but you also want to help protect them from misinformation.
So how do we strike that balance?
Well, I think the key is to approach the conversation with empathy and respect. You can start by simply asking questions like, hey, I saw this post you shared. Where did you see this information? Or have you seen any official reports about this?
Yeah, just open a dialogue instead of launching into a lecture.
Right, exactly. You might also share a link to a fact-checking website or article, or simply express your doubts in a gentle way. The goal is to plant a seed of doubt, encourage them to think critically, and maybe even inspire them to do a little digging themselves.
So it's not about being the misinformation police. What about helping our loved ones become more discerning consumers of information themselves?
Exactly, and ultimately that's what we're all striving for, isn't it? A world where everyone feels empowered to question what they see online, to seek out reliable sources, and to be part of the solution, not the problem.
I love that it's like we're all in this together, trying to navigate this complex digital world and emerge on the other side as more informed and empowered individuals.
Absolutely, and the more we practice these habits, checking sources, considering context, pausing before sharing, the stronger our collective immunity to misinformation becomes. It's like building a mental firewall that protects us from those harmful rumors and allows us to make informed decisions based on facts, not fear.
And you know what's interesting is that this whole conversation, it's not just about avoiding the bad stuff, it's also about seeking out the good stuff. Like you mentioned earlier, there are so many great resources out there. that are dedicated to combating misinformation.
No, absolutely. Fact-checking websites, reputable news organizations, educational platforms, there's a whole ecosystem of resources designed to help us separate fact from fiction.
So it's not just about being defensive, it's about being proactive. It's about equipping ourselves with the knowledge and tools we need to navigate this information landscape with confidence.
It's wild, right? All this talk about misinformation and fact-checking. It's like we've all become these digital detectives.
You're exactly right. We have to be so much more aware of the information we're consuming, especially during a crisis. Just like with those LA fires and those crazy AI-generated images.
Oh, man, those things were everywhere. It's kind of scary how easily we can be tricked by a picture.
I know, especially when it plays on our emotions. Like when you see a picture of something that looks really dangerous or scary, your brain kind of goes into overdrive.
You don't stop to think, you just react.
Exactly. And that's when misinformation can really take hold.
So how do we avoid falling for these visual traps?
Well, the first step is to always question what you see. Don't just assume that a picture is telling the whole story.
Right, because even if a picture is real,
Yeah.
it doesn't necessarily mean that it's accurate. Think about those photos of the Hollywood sign. They were real pictures, but they were created by AI. They had nothing to do with the actual fires.
It's like taking a photo of a sunny day and then saying it's proof that it never rains.
Exactly. Context is everything.
So how do we make sure we're getting the full context?
Well, one thing you can do is diversify your information sources. Don't just rely on one website or one social media platform.
That makes sense. It's like getting a second opinion from a doctor.
Exactly. You want to make sure you're getting a well-rounded view of the situation.
And what about those times when you're just not sure who to trust?
Well, look for signs of credibility. Is the source clearly identified? Are they transparent about their methods? Do they have a history of fact-checking and accountability?
So basically, we need to be a little bit skeptical of everything we see online.
Not skeptical exactly, but discerning.
Discerning.
Okay, I like that. We need to think critically about the information we're consuming.
Yeah.
And not just accept everything at face value.
And most importantly, don't be afraid to slow down.
Yeah, we live in a world where everything is so fast-paced. But when it comes to important news, it's worth taking the time to verify.
Especially during a crisis.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You don't want to spread misinformation, even if you're doing it unintentionally.
It's kind of like that old saying, measure twice, cut once.
Exactly. But in the online world, it's verify twice, share once.
I love that. It's a great way to think about it.
And remember, it's not just about protecting yourself. It's about protecting your community.
If you see someone sharing something that seems off, don't be afraid to speak up.
You can do it respectfully, of course. Maybe share a link to a fact-checking website, or just express your doubts in a gentle way.
The goal is to help people become more aware of the problem.
And to encourage them to think critically about the information they're sharing.
It's like we're all in this together.
We are. We're all part of this interconnected web of information, and we all have a role to play in keeping it clean.
So to wrap things up, what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away from this deep dive?
I want them to remember that they have the power to be informed. They don't have to be passive consumers of information. They can be active participants in the fight against misinformation.
I love that. Be informed, be proactive, and be a part of the solution.
Exactly.
Well said. Well, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive. Thanks for joining us. And remember, knowledge is power, but only when it's grounded in truth. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay vigilant.